In this episode, we talk about all things related to how your diet can impact your mental health. As we know, mental well-being is multidimensional, impacted by events as far back as your childhood, nutritional deficiencies, lifestyle habits, and physical health. And these are important to manage in order to stay well. I'm very excited to introduce our guest today, who will be able to shed some light on these different factors. Helen Duyvestyn is a registered nurse with over 15 years experience in the area of mental health and completed training with the Australasian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. She is currently working at Middlemore Hospital as a clinical nurse specialist, as well as her own private practice. Helen is passionate about getting to the core of mental health issues and believes that this cannot be achieved with a conventional medical approach alone. We can't wait to dive deep into our conversation today. Off, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you even got onto wanting to learn about nutrition and its role in mental health?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting story. I was working in psychiatry, in mainstream psychiatry for many years, and what actually happened is about 8 years ago, I sort of began to feel quite burnt out, and my own experience of working in a sort of mainstream psychiatric area where it was very much talk therapy and medication. And even though those things work really well, what I was finding is that we were getting a lot of people sort of having a revolving door. So people coming in, getting treated, going out, and then sort of often coming back in again. And I sort of thought we were really missing something about how to support people to get truly, truly well. And so I started to do a lot of research. I actually left my job. I took a year off, and I started in that time to do a lot of research and investigating as to, well, what makes a person mentally well and healthy. And I started studying about resilience and the science of happiness and all these other wonderful things that we know contribute to wellness, lifestyle medicine. But one of the things I kept coming across in my research and my reading was about nutrition. And I thought, well, this is fascinating because in all my years of working in psychiatry, we almost never asked someone about their diet or what they ate. And so I started to sort of really delve into the research around this. And then there were a few real light bulb moments for me, which I'll bring up today, that really made me think, wow, we are really missing something super important when it comes to mental wellness and well-being. So that's kind of how I got into this. So I wouldn't have thought that this would be part of my journey, so to speak, as a nurse, because it seemed like something that nutrition would only be something that the dietitians would talk about. But the more I learned, the more I thought, we have to bring this to the table. We have to really get people to understand why it's so important.
Yeah, and I think it's always really powerful when you not only bring your personal experience and its impact and the journey that you've gone on, as well as the clinical lens to make sure that you can filter out what's the snake oil versus the thing that actually will work based on the evidence. So, let's kick into that. Tell me more about the role of nutrition and mental health.
So one of the things I found when I was reading all the research is that there's just this very high correlation between a junk food diet, and a junk food diet is around, highly processed foods, lots of takeaway foods, that sort of thing. So there's this wonderful correlation between a junk food diet and poorer mental health. So if you have a very poor diet, you're going to have increased rates of depression and anxiety. So the research is really, really clear about that. And I started to sort of think, well, is this just because people who are depressed then don't have the energy to cook well and eat well? So then in about 2017, there was a wonderful study published called the SMILE study. And what they did is that they took a bunch of people, there were about 60 or so people, who were diagnosed as having a depression. And they gave half of them what they call a modified Mediterranean diet. So they changed their diet from what was considered a STAT diet, which was a standard Australian diet because it was an Australian study, and they got them to have a modified Mediterranean diet and monitored them for 12 weeks. And then at the end of 12 weeks, they reassessed them. And what they found is that over 30% of the people that changed their diet were no longer depressed. So this diet really started to give us an indication that actually what you eat can make a difference to how you feel and have
That
a
is
big difference on your mental health. Yeah.
that is really powerful, isn't it? That's not just like, oh,
Yeah.
5%. It's almost like half the people who made the change really had that impact. Maybe tell us a little bit about like what's a standard Australian diet and what's a Mediterranean diet, so we actually know what the difference is as well.
Sure. So the standard Australian diet is often otherwise referred to as the Western diet, and it's generally quite high in processed foods. There's probably a little bit too much meat, a little bit too much takeaways. So it's really a diet that is quite far away from what our sort of great grandparents, for example, would have eaten. The Mediterranean diet, or the modified Mediterranean diet that they used in the study, was very much based on whole foods, whole grains, lots of fruit and vegetables. In that specific diet, they use lots of olive oil and nuts and seeds as well. What's important to know and understand is that it doesn't cut anything out of the diet. Like, it's not like it's not a vegan diet, or you don't have to be extreme with the diet. It's just like a really whole food diet, eating lots of plants and lots of vegetables, and really having that as the main part of your diet. And that's what almost all the studies are really based on. They all sort of come back to, actually, if we have a whole food diet, that seems to really be associated with better mental health and well-being.
Yeah, no, that sounds really great. And I think that, being able to know that it doesn't mean that you have to restrict what you eat and still can have a very full diet. I think that will remove some of the concerns people have. But of course, we live the life that we do. We're all very busy. Takeaway is almost like a necessary evil. Did you delve anything into the research or from your clinical practice that helps us understand, well, how do we integrate these wholesome type of diet instead of relying on more processed food, takeaways, high carb, high protein?
I think it's, Angela, I think it's about keeping it very simple and not getting too tied up with, because, people can get really tied up in, oh, it's keto, or, I have to have certain amount of fats, carbs, and proteins. I really think it's about keeping it simple. And so if you can ensure that your diet, if you can really just make sure that most of your food, it's not all of your food, but most of your food, if you can cook at home, for example, and you know what's actually going in your food, that's something that in itself will be really supportive to your mental health and well-being. So just keeping it really simple. Don't get too complicated with the food. Make sure that go to the farmer's market if you can, fill up your fridge with the fruit and veggies, and eat those before you sort of eat anything else. There's a lot of other things now, I think, that are really helpful for people. There are things like the My Food Bag and things like that can actually support people to cook at home and start nurturing their well-being by what they cook in the kitchen. That can make a big difference.
Yeah, that's really a good, for those who can afford these type of food and the costs associated, you try to find that convenience with the healthy eating. And also, I live out in South Auckland. There's always a Sunday market, and, buying vegetables, you can, $10-20 can really fill up a whole week's worth of groceries, which is really great.
And lots of legumes and things too. Sorry.
That's
lots
great.
of legumes, those sorts of things that are quite cheap. They take a bit of extra prep, but you prep it in bulk. That can be super helpful.
Exactly. And that's the thing. If you're finding it challenging to cook regularly, cook in bulk, freeze it and then take it out when you don't have time. So these are just very basic habits that we can do to kind of incorporate a good diet as part of our daily habits and lifestyle. And you mentioned that you worked in Middlemore Hospital. I live in South Auckland. Often, sometimes we grow up in communities that have not seen what it means to cook healthy, and good portion size and that kind of stuff.
True.
What are the things that you've seen in your clinical practice that are healthy tips that you can share with our audience today?
Well, I think, like I said, it is about keeping it simple. And what I love is a little saying that Michael Pollan put together. He's a journalist, and he sort of talked about eating food mostly plant and not too much. So if you really focus on, like I said, using plants as the base, or whole foods as a base, that is what's actually going to support you to eat really well. Some of the little things, like I remember seeing people in hospital, for example, and the hospital diet isn't that great, and you walk into the room and there's a big bucket of Kentucky Fried and a thing of Fanta, and so sort of having that understanding and sort of talking to them and saying, you know what, you want to get out of here kind of quickly. What's your favourite food? What's your traditional food that you used to eat? If you go back, if, for example, this person was from Samoa, go back to the traditional food. And this was quite a young boy, and he said, I really love raw fish, and I said, fantastic. Can you get someone to bring that in for you? And go back to sort of thinking about what your grandparents or your great-grandparents might have eaten, but bringing in the knowledge we have today as well about knowing that really high amounts of lard, for example, aren't good for us. I think we know that saturated fats aren't very good for us. So going back to very traditional diets can be something that can be really, really helpful in thinking about how do I want to eat.
Yeah, tell us more about that. How does a poor diet lead to poor mental health? You mentioned lard, but any examples or research that you've seen?
This was one of the things that was a real light bulb moment for me. After many, many years in work in psychiatry, no one had really sort of discussed with me, well, how does food make a difference to your mood? And so what I learned is that when we eat food, obviously it breaks down and our body absorbs it. One of the things that neurotransmitters, so we hear about these things called neurotransmitters. We've often heard about this thing called serotonin, which is one of the neurotransmitters that some of the antidepressants target. Serotonin is known as kind of the happy hormone or the happy neurotransmitter. And how it's made in our body is actually made from proteins that are broken down into amino acids. So we eat food that contains proteins, and obviously with proteins we think of meat, but it can also be whole grains and tofu, so it doesn't always need to be a meat source. Comes into our body, gets broken down, and then those little amino acids need the cofactors of vitamins and minerals to actually transform themselves into a neurotransmitter such as serotonin. So if you're not eating some of the nutrients that your body needs to create these neurotransmitters, you're not actually going to be producing enough neurotransmitters to keep you mentally well. And one of the things that's really interesting is that people that have low folate levels, so folate is one of the B vitamins, and it's in green leafy vegetables. We get most of our folate from green leafy vegetables. If we don't have reasonable levels of folate, we are less likely to respond to our antidepressants. So if you go along to your GP and not feeling very well, and the GP puts you on an antidepressant, if you've got really low folate levels, it might be that antidepressant doesn't work so well. So we need to sort of understand a little bit about how those nutrients actually help us make neurotransmitters. And so eating well is kind of like giving you the basic ingredients. It's like baking a cake, you don't actually have all the ingredients. So eating folate, green leafy vegetables, vitamins and minerals actually is the thing that supports us to make the neurotransmitters in our brain to keep us well.
Nice. How do I know that I have deficiency in, any of these nutrients?
Yeah.
Can you share, is there tests I should be doing, or is there signs that I would see?
Yeah, honestly, Angela, we know that this is really hard because there are some blood tests that you can do. You can go along to your GP and they can test for folate. So folate's definitely one of the ones that they can test for. They often, so folate and B12, because they work quite closely together. So they can easily test for that. But a lot of the other vitamins and minerals, it's not easy to test in the blood. So you're not necessarily going to know that you've got a deficiency. What you can do is, we all know how we feel, and I think that anybody that's sort of struggling with fatigue, with poor wound healing, so if you get a scratch or something on your body and you find that it's taking quite a long time to heal, some of those sorts of things can indicate a vitamin deficiency. There are some really common vitamin deficiencies that we know people struggle with, and there's some research that says that people that are admitted to a sort of a psychiatric unit, 75% of them have low vitamin D levels, for example. So vitamin D is mainly from sunshine. It's exposing our skin to the sun, and we know that a large percentage of people in the psychiatric units are very low in vitamin D. So some of these deficiencies aren't easy to detect. But I really suggest that if you're struggling with fatigue, low mood, definitely pop along to your GP and ask for some tests to be done. Yeah, it's a real tricky one, and I think a lot of people also have got post-COVID fatigue, and that's something as well that people are really struggling with, and that can also affect our mood and well-being. Once again, highly encouraged. I think everyone should be going to the GP, once a year, getting blood tests, seeing how things are in their body, getting to know and understand, what's actually really important, what good levels are, for example, of these nutrients.
Yeah, and that's the thing, being tired has a whole bunch of reasons. But, if you have poor wound healing, you cut yourself, it's taking a very long time to heal, that's a really good indication around that. And also, I think the other thing as well is around, just the basic stuff around going out there, being out there in the sunlight.
Some of the things that I think that are most beneficial are actually really simple. Going outside, going for a walk, eating good food. I always consider them the pillars. They're the pillars of physical health and they're the pillars of mental health. Good sleep, good nutrition, and movement.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we've had a really good run through so far on the basics. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Helen?
I think one of the things that I often get asked is what sort of supplements might be helpful for people. And this is also a really tricky one, because one of the things that's really important to understand is that we're all individual and we all have different reasons why we might be struggling with our mood. So for some people it is a nutrient deficiency, but for some people it's something completely different. So it's not easy to just blanket say, oh yes, take zinc and you'll be fine, or take a B vitamin and you'll be fine. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, take a supplement or do this one change. And this is where it's important to start to sort of investigate a little bit about all the factors that might be impacting on your mental health and well-being. That it's not simply one thing. It could be many things, and we need to approach mental health and well-being from a really holistic way and take in all aspects of our brain and body health, as well as you mentioned right at the beginning, what we sort of grew up with, and the traumas that we might have experienced and how that might have also impacted our mental health and well-being. So when it comes back to sort of looking at supplements, once again, I would highly recommend that you go to your GP first, rule out to see if there's any obvious deficiencies. But there's been some really lovely research that came out just in March this year, actually, which looked at all the multivitamins or the specific nutrients, and also some of the herbal medicines that have been found to be good for depression and anxiety. And one of the things that have come out quite regularly is zinc. Zinc seems to be one thing that people are often deficient in, and has found to make quite a bit of difference to people that have mental health issues. The B vitamins are often quite good for people who have experienced stress, for example. And then there's a couple of other herbal medicines that have been found to be good for people suffering from depression or anxiety. Really important to check your GP before you start on any of those, because some of the nutrients or vitamins can affect medication that you take. So it's really important to get that sorted as well.
Yeah, no, that's really great. That's good advice. Talking to your GP first, seeing if the GP is picking up anything else. So you wouldn't necessarily recommend a standard of vitamin or supplement. I guess that's what most people want to just pop a pill and then I'm done.
For some people I do. For some people definitely. If I hear their story and I'm concerned, especially because, like I mentioned, sometimes when you are very depressed, it's very hard to have a good appetite. Your appetite is really affected quite badly, and same with your anxious. So definitely for some people I will say, look, you haven't been eating well for a long time. I can see that you don't have an appetite. It might be helpful for a short amount of time to actually take an extra supplement. But it's like everything. It's the same as whether you're taking antidepressant or not. You can't just rely on the one thing. You also need to look at everything else that's going on for that person. So, yeah.
Wonderful. It doesn't look like we have any much other questions on this. And I'm sure we will drop some links around the research that you're referencing to as well, that other people can listen more into and find out for themselves.
Definitely.
Yes. So other than that, it doesn't look like there's any further questions. Do you want to share anything else before we close off?
I thought maybe just a couple of other studies that I think are really interesting, because one of the studies that I sort of had a look at was around people. There was a study that was done. It was actually done in 2002, and it looked at people in prison. So this was looking at prisoners, and they wanted to know whether a supplement, a multivitamin and omega-3 would make a much difference to what they called offences while they were in prison. So they looked at their behaviour before they took the supplements, and then they looked at their behaviour after they had supplements for a couple of weeks. And what they found with the people that took the supplements is that was a 35% reduction in offences from these prisoners. So I thought what was fascinating is it's not only that the change in their nutritional status changed probably the way they felt, but it also changed their behaviour. So their behaviour actually was changed by having good nutrition. And I think that that's absolutely fascinating that can have such an effect. We know that in areas that there's food deserts, what they call food deserts, where it's really hard for people to get access to fresh food, and that's a massive problem, and that can also affect a person's ability to actually eat well. So there's and I sort of think, what difference does that make to the people that in that area that struggle with mood and maybe other sort of socioeconomic problems around that. So I just think it's a really fascinating subject, and there's so much that we could be doing to actually look at how we can improve the mental health of the country in some ways. Because I think if we look at the blueprints and a lot of mental health things, nutrition is not often mentioned. I don't know if you've experienced that, Angela, when you've obviously done lots of research around mental health. There's not a lot often written about nutrition and what are we eating, what are we feeding ourselves.
That's right. And I think the challenges even in the hospital setting is there's not enough dietitians, and those are the people who really need it, or not enough nutritionists. Really, as much as we can upskill ourselves, that would be super helpful, right? And that will improve. And I think it lies back down to what, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really around demonstrating that your thoughts affects your behaviors, and it always this cyclical loop, and diet is another contributor to that loop. So thank you
Totally.
again, Helen. It's been a great conversation with you. I think you really upskilled everyone today around the basics to look out for. How do I know whether I need a bit more help? Should I go to see my GP? What tasks could I do? What are the basic diet changes I could make? And practical tips on how we can manage this in a very busy world that we live in.